But yeah, like I think this is an endemic problem in modern society. And the way I would put it to people is that I think of anger as being the royal road to self improvement.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin, and today I have the privilege of talking with Donald Robertson. Donald is an author and cognitive-behavioural psychotherapist. He's quite well known in the Stoic community. He's written several books on Stoicism, a lot around Marcus Aurelius. He wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which of course is all about Marcus Aurelius. He has a new graphic novel coming out called Verissimus, which everyone's really excited about. We had a great talk. I really enjoyed our chat. I hope you enjoy it. Please welcome Donald Robertson. All right, Donald Robertson, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to our wee chat.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to hear. So you got a new graphic novel coming out, which I know you're excited about, and I think a lot of people are excited about, called Verissimus. I think I got that pronunciation right. Yeah, so how does that feel? Are you excited about that?
Oh, yeah, I've been excited for about 3 years. Like, for the thing about publishing is it's kind of like, it takes a long time, and then suddenly the thing comes out, and it kind of like everybody goes kind of crazy in the build up to it, publicizing it and things. So the graphic novel, I didn't realize naively, like all the best ventures in life, I didn't really know what I was getting into, and I naively assumed that it was like a book like any other, and usually you get about a year or sometimes a bit less to write a book, and but graphic novels take a lot longer, especially ones as big as this. So it's taken us like 2 or 3 years or something like that to do it. I spoke to the guys that wrote, spoke to the illustrator actually for Logicomics, which is kind of comparable thing. It was a best-selling graphic novel, came out a few years ago, New York Times bestseller, about the history of Western philosophy, kind of philosophy of language and logic, Frege and Wittgenstein and these kind of guys. And my kind of jaw dropped in the middle of the conversation when the guy mentioned in passing Alacost said that it took them 6 or 7 years to finish it.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, it's not going to take us like 7 years to do this, is it? Like, so I'm relieved. The feeling, it's more a feeling of relief than excitement that it's over with. But I was also writing another book at the same time, which my publisher kind of assured me shouldn't happen, and somehow it ended kind of up happening. So I wrote a biography of Marcus Aurelius for Yale University Press, a conventional prose biography, I have to say now. And so I've written 3 books in a row about the same guy, and all of them were biographical. So I wrote a self-help book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor that's based around biographical anecdotes. Then I wrote a graphic novel about his life. Then I wrote a conventional prose biography. Also wrote a thing about him for the Cambridge Companion to the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and also edited and wrote the foreword to the Capstone Classics edition of the Meditations. So I'm kind of all Marcus Aurelius. I've got Marcus Aurelius overload at the moment. So actually I've just started writing another book which is about someone else. My main feeling at the moment is a sense of relief that I'm getting to write about a different philosopher for a change. So I'm writing a book about Socrates at the moment.
Oh, cool. Well, it's interesting, Socrates. I mean, most people know that name too, but Marcus Aurelius seems to be the way that a lot of people come into Stoicism because he's just so cool, right? You do a bit of research, you're like, holy crap, he's a Roman emperor and somehow a Stoic and very humble, and you read his meditations, so it speaks to a lot of people. I'm interested to talk about sort of the spirit of things, right? So, for example, you mentioned you wrote several books on Marcus Aurelius, and the most recent here, or the Verissimus, the graphic novel. So it's interesting to me that you can take something like Stoicism, or certainly a book built on Stoic principles, and it can transcend the medium, right? So like you can learn Stoicism through obviously books, which a lot of people do. You can learn it through conversations with people, and now you can learn it through graphic novels. So I'm very interested in this idea because it seems like certain mediums speak to different people. So what do you think about that in terms of like the spirit of things transcending the medium?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in over the course of my life. I guess I've seen a lot of examples of people getting into things like Stoicism in surprising ways. I remember, and this is ages ago, and I forget now how long ago this was, when Gladiator came out, which was about 22 years ago. Like, when Gladiator, so there might be people listening to your podcast that weren't even born when Gladiator came out, which seems weird to me. But when Gladiator came out, because Richard Harris plays Marcus Aurelius in the first act, so it doesn't really mention the meditations or Stoicism, but loads of people went out, like looked up Marcus Aurelius and read the meditations. There was a big surge of interest in it after that movie came out, and they just thought it was cool. Like you were saying, you said Marcus Aurelius was cool. I love Marcus Aurelius, and I wouldn't normally brag about something like that. I kind of feel confident saying I probably know about as much about him as anyone else alive today, because I've spent so much time writing about him and studying him. But I think of him more as a bit of a massive nerd. Like, he was kind of cool in a way, like, but he was also an incredibly nerdy guy and kind of known for it. He was really an eternal student and stuff. And he's kind of like you were hinting earlier. He's also a kind of gateway drug to getting into Socrates, who's a very different character, like a whole different ballgame. But the graphic novel format, it's very similar to a movie in some ways. Writing a graphic novel is very similar to creating a storyboard or writing a script for a movie, right down to the fact that you would describe the panels in ways that you would describe the angle of a camera shot and stuff like that. So it's different. It's different in some ways from writing a prose book. In terms of the audience, I don't know. Like I'm waiting with bated breath to find out what the audience is. People falsely, I think, assume that kids will read it. Or not false, but not entirely accurately, because graphic novels like this tend to be aimed at slightly older teenagers, maybe at least. It's probably not suitable for small kids. It's not like the Beano or the Dandy or whatever, like there's quite a lot of violence in ancient Rome, and there's some nudity and some pretty hardcore philosophizing about, coming to terms with your own mortality and a graveyard and stuff like that, and guys getting crucified and getting their heads chopped off and things like that. So it's not like a kid's comic book, but I think it will appeal maybe to a slightly younger demographic. And, I kind of get the feeling that different people are reading it than would normally read self-help books and things like that. Actually, what I would say, one of my main observations about Stoicism is it's self-help for people that don't like self-help, in a sense. When I teach about Stoicism, often people in the audience will tell me that they've never read any self-help books or anything like that, because they'll say, I'm not into that kind of stuff. Like, there's usually a few tough guys in the audience, so I don't read stuff like that. Usually guys, sometimes it's women. Often when I've been talking to the police force or the military or whatever, those guys are like, I don't read self-help books. But they love Marcus Aurelius, and then reading Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism kind of gets them into learning about CBT and stuff like that. When I taught psychotherapy, and they would, I would be amazed if someone in the audience hadn't read self-help books. So it's quite a contrast to me. And so what that suggests is it's the good side of that is that psychological self-improvement techniques and therapy concepts and stuff might be reaching a whole sector of society that they hadn't reached before. And that's of a lot of interest to me as a psychotherapist, because I know one of the problems with psychotherapy, we worry a lot as psychotherapists about how to make the techniques more effective and how to make the treatment work, but there's a more fundamental problem, which is a lot of people just never go for treatment in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? And the main demographic actually that don't go for treatment is men suffering from social anxiety, who I guess you might guess by the nature of that disorder, there's kind of shame and self-consciousness are feature prominently in it. So we know that's one of the groups that are least likely to actually seek out therapy and go and have CBT or something like that.
Yeah.
But some of these guys go see Gladiator, or they read books about history or whatever, and that kind of gets them somehow into Stoicism and learning about techniques that might benefit them. So I find that very rewarding and exciting. It means this is kind of fresh blood for therapy. Like, these are people that really need help, that haven't got any strategies that they've learned from stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting, and maybe people do take something different. The ancient Stoics thought the best way to learn Stoicism wasn't from lectures, actually. I think it's pretty clear, and they state this explicitly at times, that they think the best way to learn Stoicism is by making the acquaintance of somebody who's more experienced in practicing it. So, for example, they all thought like knowing Socrates or knowing Zeno personally, like would be like the best way, like having a kind of role model or a mentor, like that you could make a personal acquaintance with, was much better than just reading books and stuff like that. So it's hard to do that today, but maybe a slight, small, tiny step closer to that is if we can really visualize what Marcus Aurelius, for instance, might have been like as a living, breathing human being, and then we put flesh and blood, we put a human face on Stoicism rather than it just being something kind of abstract that we read about in a book.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I do think like there's something about a story that appeals to a lot of people. And it's interesting. I never thought about it in sort of like the masculine macho, don't want to help themselves kind of thing. But stories seem to be a great way that men in particular sort of learn some of those lessons, because it's no longer weird. Like, not that it's weird to go to therapy or anything like that, but that's sort of how they perceive it. Whereas, okay, if you go to a superhero movie, if you read a cool book on Marcus Aurelius, a graphic novel that's telling this interesting story with lessons infused to it, it's a little bit more, let's say, approachable and palatable for a lot of people, which is good.
A different group, a different demographic, it affects them in a different way. I'll tell you something else about this that I realised quite early on, that so what are the obstacles in teaching people about Stoicism? Well, that's easy to answer in a way. The big obstacle is that Stoicism has always, since its inception, been a victim of certain misconceptions about its nature, like many philosophies, right? There's a kind of caricatured version of it. Now, that preponderates on the internet, that's all over the internet. So, like, there's loads of people that think Stoicism is just about kind of being unemotional or, like, emotionally repressed or something like that, like having a stiff upper lip and all this kind of stuff. And there's loads of people that think Stoicism would be just about accepting stuff and being politically passive and not standing up to dictators or anything like that. You just accept everything, right? And those are caricatures of Stoicism. Now, we have two options. We can sit and argue with people and say that doesn't follow from what the Stoics say, or we can say that's not what the Stoics actually say in their books. But that's a tedious argument, and usually people who are kind of entrenched in those misconceptions won't back down, even if you cite chapter and verse and show, hang on a minute, but Seneca says the opposite, Marcus Aurelius says the opposite here, and Like, it's not the most effective way to persuade them. But if you can say, here's a Stoic I made earlier, as it were, and show them a living, breathing example, like that, in my experience, is a much more powerful way to refute those misconceptions. So if you were to meet Marcus Aurelius, like, you'd only have to say, well, let's look at Marcus Aurelius for a minute, or any of the famous Stoics, right? Like, if you saw what he's actually like, from what we know about him, and by the way, I have to digress for a minute and just deal with another sort of misconception. I'll pause and come back. I'll pick up the thread in a minute, but just to say, like, one of the things I found is that some people believe that we don't know anything about Marcus Aurelius for some weird reason. They have this misconception that we don't know anything about this guy. We know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do probably about most other, or maybe even any other ancient philosopher. Why would that be? Because he was a big deal back in the day. Yeah. Like, he was the Roman emperor, and there are many statues of him, there are inscriptions, there are coins, there are 3 major surviving histories of his reign. We have a record of his legal actions in the Roman legal digests. We have lots of anecdotes about him in other writings. We have a cache of his private letters. We've got we've got a ton of evidence, basically, that tell us about his life, his character, the environment in which he lived, from several different really interesting perspectives. So we know a bunch about this guy. Okay, so let's say we can pull this guy out and go, here's Marcus Aurelius, right? So does he seem like he's like Mr. Spock or a robot or something like that? Does he seem like a completely cold-hearted and unemotional sort of guy? Like, no, he was incredibly affectionate. You want to read his letters. By modern standards, people are very surprised. He seems extremely overly affectionate towards his friends. He's a very kind of gregarious, very good-humoured, friendly, loving parent. That might not come through in the meditations, because he's writing actually a bunch of exercises there about contemplating death and stuff. So you wouldn't expect it to. It doesn't really reveal his personality. But in his letters, we get an incredibly privileged glimpse into the private life of a Roman emperor. It's extraordinary.
Do you think, just a quick question, do you think how he was portrayed in Gladiator is sort of representative in your mind of roughly what his personality was?
I'm going to say something shocking here, and maybe this is something I like movies and plays and stuff like that. Peter Ustinov did a play called Barefoot in Athens about Socrates, and I think it's like pretty much what I imagine Socrates was. People always think, oh, it's not accurate and stuff. Right, Marcus Aurelius, apart from the fact that Richard Harris doesn't look anything like him, right? And in Gladiator, I know people are going to go nuts and say, oh, it's fiction, that didn't really happen, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's not as implausible as people think. Actually, the character of Maximus, it's obvious to me, is based on Marcus Aurelius' son-in-law to a large extent. Claudius Pompeianus, his name was, right? He had a different name. But Marcus allegedly asked him to become Caesar and serve as an interim ruler before Commodus was appointed sole emperor. So that's not crazy inaccurate. And then the other thing that seems outrageous is Marcus Aurelius at the beginning of Gladiator says, I think we're done with this emperor stuff and we should just go back to the Republic. Which seems like a ridiculous thing to many people to say. Well, they should go read the Meditations, because it's even crazier what he says in there. Like in book 1 of the Meditations, he says that his political ideals are a republic in which everyone is equal, and you kind of think that doesn't sound like the empire. I mean, and maybe in some sense he thinks that these things could be reconciled, but he says everyone is equal under the law, which surely would be a much more egalitarian society than the Roman Empire. So I don't know. I think it's not as absurd as it might seem, although obviously it's fiction.
Yeah.
The stuff that I've written, people thought was fiction, and it's not. Like the stuff that I've written is different, from Gladiator. Gladiator is a work of fiction, but not as crazy as it seems. The stuff that I've written is not fiction. It's slightly dramatized, very closely based. We're trying to retell the story that's in the Roman histories. And so, for example, in the graphic novel, right down to the level of, I've been, to Carnuntum. I spent a week there interviewing the CEO and the director of archaeology there. I toured the whole location where Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, in Austria. And I've been in Greece to some of the locations that we have in the graphic novel there. We got experts to advise us on the military equipment. And in terms of even the dialogue, using the private letters and also Roman poetry gives us ideas about colloquial expressions in Rome. So I know, for instance, that Marcus Aurelius actually refers to Fronto, his rhetoric tutor, as best of masters. That's how he addresses him. So in the graphic novel, the way the dialogue that we have to introduce dialogue, which to a large extent has to be made up, but it draws very heavily on things he actually says in the letters,
right, or
in speeches, or in the Meditations. It uses figures of speech, tons of phrase that we know were extant at that time. The other thing I should say, the other misconception would be that Stoics are passive. They kind of sit on their hands and, if you were a Stoic, you would just accept Nazism or something like that. You would just, I just have to accept this and amor fati and go with the flow and, rather than, trying to oppose it or anything. Well, that's crazy, right? Because historically the Romans the Stoics were famous for opposing tyranny and dying. There's a whole bunch of Stoic martyrs that opposed several Roman emperors who were autocratic in nature. And so Marcus Aurelius did not stay at home. He was a workaholic, and when he was 40 years old, without really having any military training to speak of, and in the middle of a plague, he left Rome, possibly leaving that region of Italy for maybe the first time in his life, and rode across the Alps to Austria to take command of the largest army ever massed on a Roman frontier. And was in danger on several levels. Firstly, from dying of the plague. We know that was a big, serious threat in the military camps that other people were scared of.
Yeah.
Like Commodus, for example, bailed eventually because he was like, I don't want to get plague here, but Marcus didn't. And also because we're told that 20,000 Romans had been slaughtered in a single battle at Carnuntum, and several high-ranking Roman officers had died in battle. So Marcus didn't, even in Carnuntum, in the fortress, he didn't know for sure like that he was completely safe there. But so he wasn't like passive. His life is the opposite of that. He was a man of determination and vigorous action. It was like he worked very hard. I think many people have this idea, a caricature of a Roman emperor as being like Nero, and this kind of caricature that they're just like a celebrity, and they go, oh, this is great, I'm really wealthy and powerful, I'll just drink a lot of wine and have orgies and things like that. And Marcus Aurelius' life was nothing like that. He thought of himself as a career politician, like he took his job incredibly seriously. He was constantly studying. He served as a judge, as a magistrate, even as emperor, and he studied jurisprudence throughout his life. He studied rhetoric because he took giving speeches extremely seriously. He was exceptionally dedicated and hardworking and conscientious about the role of emperor, which he saw as like a job, a career in a sense, or vocation maybe would be a better way of putting it. So some of the main misconceptions that people have about Stoicism just aren't even refuted, but they just kind of melt away when you look at an actual living example of a Stoic. Yeah. And I guess that allows us to see it in a more human and kind of rounded and balanced way, whereas people, I think, if they're just reading the texts, are more likely to kind of caricature some of the aspects of the philosophy.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the biggest things that kind of drives me crazy online is when I say that Stoicism is pro-social, and then I'll get comments saying, what do you mean, a pro-social Stoic? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, hold on a minute. Have you met someone that's like an actual Stoic? Like, have you actually like, and it's so interesting because if you actually read any of the Stoic books, especially the ancient texts, it's pretty obvious that that's what it's built on. But people sort of have this idea, and I think maybe it comes from misinterpreting what it means to live according to nature, right? They think, okay, I'm going to go in the woods and live, the Facebook post of go away and live in a cabin in the woods for $1 million kind of thing. But it's hard
to comment on that without sounding a little bit dismissive. But I'll do my best. But where it comes from is people, I think, in part, like, first of all, there's got to be some kind of weird confirmation bias going on there. Yeah. Because it's clearly, easily, demonstrably the opposite of what, and I'll come back to that in a moment, right? So let's just start off with the assumption these people are way off the mark, right? And then we'll talk about the reason why they are in a minute. So either they're just got this weird confirmation bias, like, towards that, or in some cases they have, like, some of the people who are most vocal online, I don't know if you've noticed this, but some of the people who shout the loudest online about whatever topic, they're arguing about, are the people that clearly know the least about it. It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, the people who have never actually read Marcus Aurelius are the ones that have the strongest opinions about his philosophy, in my experience, on the internet. It's just a strange phenomenon about social media. But what I'd say to them is, I've had people, it's surreal. So they'll say to me, Marcus Aurelius didn't believe in pro-social. And I say, on virtually every page of the Meditations, go back and read it again, right? On almost every page, he talks about ethical cosmopolitanism, philostorgia, or natural affection, dikaiosune, or justice, overcoming anger and alienation from our fellow men. It's the main thing. I would go so far as to say, if you include anger in that, which is kind of the contrary, anger and being pro-social, these two sides of the same coin, are without doubt the main overarching theme of the entire book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other stuff in there as well, but that's his dominant theme. Why is that? Because he's a Roman emperor. And he's got a very responsible job that has to do with managing a huge society. So of course he's going to be interested in justice and community and stuff like that, and that's exactly what he focuses on, far more, for example, than Epictetus does. But it's still there in Epictetus as well. And it reminds me of that famous saying in William Blake, the English poet. He said, "We both read the Bible day and night, but you read black where I read white, was the only way that he could, and that's how I feel about Marcus Aurelius. I think, how can you read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and not have noticed that on almost every page he emphasizes the pro-social aspect? It's his main preoccupation. But people go, oh, I didn't realize that, and go back and read the whole thing again.
Yeah.
Like, and but once you'll be like a few pages in, and you go, oh yeah, I guess so. Like, it's really bizarre. But also, just in terms of like we know what Stoicism was, right? I think people are confused about that. When I first began writing about Stoicism, it was a long time ago now, right? It was, I don't know, 25 years ago or something like that. I first began writing and teaching about the subject. And one of the first, it's interesting as well, some of the misconceptions I had to deal with, and many of the debates I had at the beginning, some of them just went away. Like, so society changed its mind about some of these things over that period of time. When I first started writing about this, people like kept telling me that the Stoics didn't have psychological techniques, that there wasn't any kind of like psychotherapy, and they were just completely wrong about that.
Yeah.
Like, but that doesn't happen anymore. Like, everyone seems to now have agreed that the Stoics have lots of psychological techniques. Then I think, geez, man, all those debates that I used to have trying to prove that to people, and now everyone seems to have gone, oh, we all agree about that now, we can move on to the next thing to get wrong. Like, yeah. But when I first started, people were like, well, Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, it's aphoristic. We don't really know what the system of philosophy was. Like that? No, we do. Like we know quite a lot about Stoicism. For a start, we have Cicero in De Finibus, basically spelling out in a dialogue, essentially a kind of lecture on the basic principles of Stoic ethics. And we can reconstruct it. There are many academic texts analysing what's in Seneca and Epictetus and other sources that we have. So we know what the principles of Stoicism. There's a lot of stuff we don't know, but because they keep banging on about what their main principles are and their assumptions. So we have a pretty good idea of what, in general terms, the system was. And so we know that Stoicism was fundamentally a pro-social philosophy, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
But a central part of it is overcoming alienation. You could say the whole of Stoicism, in a sense, revolves around the idea of overcoming a kind of fragmentation or alienation, and that's partly what living in harmony with nature and accord with nature means. And so everyone, I guess, knows that amor fati means accepting fate and stuff, and so not feeling alienated from events that befall you, like feeling, a sense of oneness with the universe. But the Stoics also want us to feel that sense of union and oneness with the rest of mankind. They think the bane of society is with anger and hatred, and when we feel as if other people are somehow separate from us. And the reason for that is the Stoics were pantheists. Like, they believed that the whole universe was one living organism, and we're like cells within the body of it. And again, Marcus Aurelius, over and over again, keeps telling himself, you should view other people and yourself as being like, the left and right hands of a body, or the upper and lower rows of teeth, we would say today, maybe two cells in the body of a larger organism. So don't think of yourself as being completely separate. He's got nothing to do with me. Think of yourself as both being part of something bigger, and and you have to get on with each other, really, and form communities and live in harmony and try and improve the world and all that kind of crazy ideas that he had. So yeah, and philosophically, it's integral. I mean, for goodness sakes, the conversations, people have told me that Stoicism has nothing to do with politics, is a thing I see a lot on the internet, which is crazy. Like, the Stoics were incredibly influential in the fields of political philosophy and jurisprudence. I mean, the founding text of Stoicism, from what we can tell, we're like 90% sure about this, it seems like the main original text was Zeno's Republic, which is clues in the name. Like, it was a critique of Plato's Republic. So it was very much like a political, utopian political text that founded the whole, movement, and that other Stoics would typically refer back to as their main original inspiration. Most of the main Stoics wrote books about politics and kingship and statesmanship and all this kind of stuff. So it's absurd that people... Yeah. And it just shows, again, it's the Dunning-Kruger, like, it just shows their own ignorance of the subject, that they don't even know, like, that these texts were important. It's because they've read a bit of Seneca, they've read a bit of Marcus Aurelius, and they go, oh, this is a bit like CBT, I don't see what that's got to do with politics. But that they have a tiny understanding of the depth of the subject. I don't think any modern serious academic for a second would say that Stoicism doesn't have anything to do with politics. That would seem bonkers to them.
Well, you'll like this one. The biggest example I have of that is someone commented on one of the posts saying that Stoicism is a slave philosophy. It's a slave mentality, right? And so I sort of challenged him on a little bit. He said, well, it's very easy to see that Epictetus writes as if he's a slave. And I said, he doesn't write as if he was a slave. He was literally a slave. So it just goes to show like how ignorant people are to, you know, to what, I don't know. But it's like you said, you come into it with these ideas and then you just, you know, you think you understand it, you just throw it.
Is when people say contradictory things, right?
Yeah.
So you get the people saying Stoicism is for slaves, and then you get people saying Stoicism is the philosophy of a privileged white elite in Roman society. It's a kind of cliche that you hear. Even occasionally some academics will say that. Now, they're both wrong. They're both absurd, like, because they're massive general. Some rich dudes were into it, so were some slaves. Like, so let's just, you know, again, it's an obvious kind of confirmation bias. So I'm going to ignore the fact that slaves were into it, and I'm going to say it's a philosophy for the rich elite, or I'm going to ignore the fact the wealthy, powerful statesmen are into it, or say it's philosophy for, like, slavish people or whatever. You're both wrong. Like, because the reality is people from all walks of society were into Stoicism. And the founder of Stoicism, Zeno, was a merchant who was shipwrecked and lived as a cynic, i.e. lived like a beggar and slept rough on the streets and stuff like that. You know, later he was put up by one of his students. He didn't own a house. And, you know, his student Cleanthes famously watered gardens at night for a living. He was a retired boxer, and he lived in poverty. Marcus Aurelius obviously was one of the most powerful men in European history, and Seneca was one of the was like a Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos of his time. He was one of the wealthiest men in history, which is another story. Like, so we've got these rich and powerful people, and then the idea that somehow maybe I suppose somebody could say that Marcus Aurelius is slave if they want to be really Nietzschean and paradoxical about it. They could say, well, Marcus Aurelius, he might be Roman emperor, but like he's got a kind of slavish, kind of Christian-like attitude. Like, to, if they were trying to make the argument maybe that Nietzsche's making, this is the only way I can try and make sense out of that. But you couldn't say that about other Stoics. Like, you wouldn't say it about Scipio Africanus, for example, the guy who conquered Carthage, was a student of Stoicism. Like, I mean, you know, how far are you going to like stretch this argument? That you know, because you'd have to, you know, you're going to dismiss even all these very powerful, influential Roman statesmen and leaders in other nations. One of the first students of Stoicism was a guy called Antigonus II Gonatus, who was a Macedonian king or emperor. Was a student of Zeno, and so he was a powerful military leader and statesman at the time, right at the beginning of Stoicism. And then other Stoics went and taught the Spartans and stuff like that. So it's an absurd idea to say that it's slavish. But people who say stuff like that are, you know, they're just like talking heads on the internet, right? Like, so there are people that tweet stuff and then never back it up with any. These are the guys, like, their confidence in what they're saying is, you know, in completely contrast to the level of familiarity with the texts that they're talking about, or the people that they're talking about.
Yeah, what was interesting, because you mentioned Marcus Aurelius, because that was one of my rebuttals was like, okay, well, look at Marcus Aurelius. You know, he was far from a slave. He's one of the most powerful, like, as you mentioned, one of the most powerful people. And, you know, the response was something like, well, didn't he have parents? Didn't he have mentors? And I said, okay, so if you're making that case, then everyone's a slave. And so it's not just Stoics that are slaves. Anyway, it's just utter nonsense. I'd like to segue a little bit into... That's confirmation bias.
So somebody's got the idea and they're trying to twist everything. Right.
Oh, I know. And yeah, at some point you just got to move on with move on with your life. But I'm very interested in the idea. So obviously you're quite knowledgeable on cognitive-behavioural therapy, which is, you know, built on Stoic principles. And I'm very interested in how today, sort of how we're bringing up the younger generation and the newer generation. And of course, all throughout history, there's no shortage of the older generation saying the younger
Yeah.
generation is garbage. It's sort of an archetype for a reason. But it's interesting to me because we do seem to be bringing up children with the idea that are sort of against Stoic principles, and certainly against cognitive behavioral therapy, such as like, okay, well, you have to, don't focus on what you can change. Don't, we'll change the system around you. We'll make grading easier. We'll make tests easier. We'll give you retests in school. We'll give everyone a participation trophy, as opposed to, you changing your behavior and making yourself better, you taking control over your own life. And I just want to mention quickly that I'm reading this book now, Setting the Bar by Shane Trotter, and he's a teacher in the U.S.
Aye.
And he makes the case that he says it directly, that it does seem to be that we're bringing up kids in the education system that is opposed to cognitive behavioral therapy principles. What are your thoughts on that, as someone who, and I know you're a father as well, and I know you're obviously concerned with mentoring and all that stuff. How do you think about that or see it?
I haven't read the book that you're talking about, but this is a well-trodden politicized debate, I would say, that it's kind of, always been a bit of a battle between conservatives and progressives, to some extent. It kind of falls along those lines. So I'm going to surprise you by saying I think they're all wrong, which is usually the case anyway, right? I think they're all wrong, and that because maybe I'm simplifying the debate, but this is kind of, I think it's useful to present it in these terms, and maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than this. But basically, it seems to me that often there are kind of progressives or people on the left that say, look, there are things in society that upset people, so what we should do is change society and eliminate those upsetting things to protect people's, so they don't get their feels hurt or whatever, And then, so don't worry, I'm going to ridicule both sides, for balance, for equal balance here, right? And then you've got people on the right that are like, well, when I was young, we used to just throw kids out and they had to fend for themselves, and then, we'd let them play in building sites and stuff like that, and then, we should just let people be exposed to upsetting and painful and distressing things, and it'll toughen them up. It's tough love. It'll be good for them in the long run or whatever. And that's also stupid. And they're both wrong. Now, the one thing I'd say about CBT, and I don't know, I emphasize that I'm not talking about the book you mentioned because I haven't read it. But what I'll see all over the internet are people who don't know anything about CBT using CBT to try to support the kind of more right-wing conservative view, which is that we should just kind of expose people to stuff that's upsetting, and they need to learn to toughen up or whatever. And their claim is that what they call CBT, and actually really it's a form of behaviour therapy called exposure therapy. By exposing, CBT shows that by exposing ourselves and facing our fears, we desensitize to them, and that's the way to go with children, right? And so most terrible arguments, that's a half truth, which ends up being turned into a falsehood. So in exposure therapy, which is a subject I could happily talk about, we know a huge amount about it. There's more research on this than just about any other psychology, and we've been known about it for well over half a century, right? So it's bread and butter part of CBT. I specialise in anxiety treatment, so particularly part of that type of therapy. All right, so let me tell you how that works in a nutshell. Yes, emotional habituation, as we call it, takes place. So if people face their fears patiently, repeatedly, for a prolonged period, i.e. for longer than normal, considerably longer than normal, and they are not doing certain specific things that would be counterproductive, that we call safety-seeking behaviours or subtle avoidance or whatever. So basically, if you do it in a repeated, controlled way for a prolonged period, 90% or more of the time, the anxiety in particular, and to some extent some other unpleasant feelings, will abate naturally. And I think that is one of the things that school kids should learn, right?
Yeah.
However, in society, it's usually not under a control. Exposure normally doesn't take place under controlled conditions, and normally it's not, funnily enough, for a prolonged enough period of time for habituation to take place. I saw someone, I'll give you an example of a specific bad argument, right? I saw somebody talking about trigger warnings for, say, in a university lecture, showing a video about like that touched on the subject of rape. As I say, there may be somebody in the audience like who's been a victim of sexual assault, and so you might want to notify them beforehand that. And this is a problematic question. It's a nuanced question. Like you might want to give them a heads up that you're going to be turning the lights down and showing a documentary about, people being raped in Africa or something like that, right? And so I've seen people say, yeah, but we should be like encouraging people to expose themselves to these things so they toughen up. That would be a terrible example, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not under controlled conditions. Because the exposure would be maybe like 30 seconds or something, it wouldn't be anywhere near long enough for emotional habituation to actually occur, right? So that's a joke. That explanation doesn't apply. And what we know is that in some cases where exposure is uncontrolled, someone's not prepared for it, and particularly if it's not long enough, it can actually sensitize them even more. Or sometimes that's called re-traumatizing somebody, right? So you might actually make them worse, right? So don't try and use psychotherapy, to justify, which these guys don't know anything about. Like, is a bogus argument to try and justify just kind of like throwing people in, expecting them to be exposed and not to be a problem. That's not how that's not how psychology works, right? But what I could say, now having kind of slagged off both sides of the argument and satirized them a little bit, there's a kind of grain of truth, right? And do you know who gets this right? The Stoics, right? Epictetus, and this is a part of Epictetus that no one ever mentions. And I think it's absolutely fundamental to understanding Stoicism, right? So Epictetus repeatedly tells his students, they present the same dilemma to him. What's the dilemma? The dilemma is, should you face problems or situations that you find distressing, or should you avoid them, right? This is what this debate essentially revolves around. So one side say you should avoid them or we should remove them because we don't want to upset people unnecessarily. And the other side say, no, you should expose yourself to them because then you'll toughen up, right? Well, they're both half right, so they're both wrong in essence, right? What Epictetus says is that you need to know yourself and study yourself, learn your limitations, and then make a judgment call about whether exposing yourself to a difficult situation in life would be overwhelming or whether you'd be able to endure it. So the truth is kind of somewhere in the middle, right? And the analogy that the Stoics use is wrestling. So to expand on what the analogy that they imply, it would be like saying, should you, like if you're a wrestler or a boxer or something, a martial artist, whatever, like, should you only fight people that you can beat really easily and avoid fighting anybody that's difficult? Well, no, because you're never going to get any better that way, right? You need to push yourself, and you need to spar against people like that are more of a challenge. Okay, should you fight some guy that's twice your size and is just going to pummel you into the ground each time, and massively outclasses you? Well, maybe not, because it's going to be demoralizing and stuff, and maybe you're not going to learn that much from that experience. So your ideal sparring partner, and you imagine an ancient Greek like gymnasia, palestra, they match people up, right? So they're going to go, this guy's about your level, or this guy's like a little bit better than you. So these are the guys that you want to wrestle and fight against, and you'll progressively get better. So not too easy and not too difficult, but somewhere in the middle. That's going to be different, and who's going to be the right balance is going to be different for each competitor, right? For each wrestler, right? And nobody's going to be able to make a general rule. They're going to say you're going to need your coach, or you yourself, to judge who's the best guy for you to spar next, right? And the idea that you should just fight everybody, is maybe not realistic. It's not going to be helpful. Or the idea that you should just avoid fighting anybody that's difficult is probably a bad idea as well. You're going to have to use your brain. Study yourself and your own performance, and then figure out what would be pushing yourself but not overwhelming yourself. And Epictetus is pretty clear about that, because it seems like common sense to him, but we don't have common sense anymore in our society, particularly among experts and journalists and people that write books like me. So the easiest way to make a big noise on the internet is just to go to one wild extreme or the other. That obviously that's usually that's how stupidity works in general, is blunt dichotomous thinking. So it's either black or white. No, like the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it kind of varies a bit from one person to another. Like, and that's what life is all about, is kind of having to figure out, like, you know, what's an appropriate amount of exposure to overcome. But a little tip that I would give is it's hard for people to understand that the duration of exposure is important, because when we expose ourselves to unpleasant situations, we naturally feel a tendency to escape the situation, to use the technical term, to leave. So if you have someone who's got cat phobia and you throw them in a room full of cats, the one thing that's pretty universal is they're going to have an overwhelming urge to open the door and run out the room, right? So they're going to have a drive to escape the situation. And, you know, so people need usually someone else present, normally a parent or a coach or a psychotherapist, to say, even though you desperately want to leave this room, I think it would be a good idea if you just kind of wait it out a little bit longer until your heart rate slows down, your anxiety will start to abate naturally. So it usually seems to be the presence of another person that encourages somebody to get past that initial hump. Like, but in normal society, when you don't have someone supporting you like that, like, that's not how things work. And just kind of like throwing people into situations where traumatic things occur is not going to make them tougher. Like, in many cases, it not in every case, but in many cases, it's unpredictable. But in a significant number of cases, it can backfire and have the opposite effect. So that's not a good strategy. So, you know, I think the debate is kind of a little bit more nuanced. And actually, another thing I'd say about that is, my specialism as a therapist was social anxiety. And so, broadly speaking, clinical trials show that exposure therapy for somebody who has like a animal phobia, like a snake phobia, a spider phobia or whatever, has roughly a 90% success rate, right? It's very simple. Like, it's a physiological, almost more than what we think of as a kind of high level emotional process. Like, it's pretty visceral. I mean, your heart rate slows down following a kind of like curve. That works even in animals, even in very primitive animals. This habituation process occurs. But social anxiety, the success rate is about 75%. It's high, but it's not as high. Yeah. Why would that be? Well, because people with social anxiety are not scared of other people's faces, right? What they're scared of is what other people might be thinking about them. And it's hard to construct a situation in practice where you expose someone to what other people might be thinking of them. It's called fear of negative evaluation, in a prolonged and repeated manner, like in an appropriately controlled way. So, like, normally in social situations, you kind of get little flickers of anxiety that kind of wax and wane and come and go. So exposure often isn't prolonged enough for the habituation to occur. Whereas if you've got spider phobia, you just set a spider in front of you and look at it for as long as you like until you get bored, right? But it's hard to expose yourself to the idea that other people are judging you negatively consistently for a long period of time. And that's one of the main reasons I think why the success rate is a little bit lower. And so in other complex social situations, exposure is often fleeting. It's often too fleeting or too ambiguous for people to benefit from it in the way that those authors that cite CBT would like to assume. But the bottom line is, here's a clue: when someone's using a piece of science to support their argument, if it looks like they probably have never read any books on the subject and don't know anything about it, like, you probably want to dig a little bit deeper as to whether the science that they're citing actually supports the things that they're saying. Yeah.
It's interesting though with children particularly, because sort of like, and you could say that's the role of the parents, but also society as a whole, and teachers play a massive role in this. That's why this particular gentleman's so concerned. But because obviously, like, you're absolutely right. When you come into the world, you're a baby. You can't exactly throw them to the wolves and say, okay, fight for yourself. You'll be tougher from it, right? That would just be ridiculous. At the same time, sort of you want to progress them as a parent. You want to progress them to the point where when they leave home, they are more or less a self-sufficient adult, right? And so it takes a lot of I guess awareness, both of yourself, but also of your child's limitations, to be able to put them on that perfect path and challenge them in the right way. I do think, though, generally speaking, I see quite a bit people not wanting to challenge their kids at all. Like, I'll give you a great example. Like, when I was a kid, I was like pretty much, I was told to be courageous as hell, right? Like, go for it. I'm not going to let you drown, but go for it. And then I was watching this kid when I was probably 17. I was watching the neighbor's kid, and he was trying to swim with his life jacket on, right? And so the kid wanted, and he was like 5 or 6 and really shallow water. There were adults there, and he wanted to take his life jacket off. And the parents said, no, you can't take the life jacket off. You gotta be safe. And I remember thinking that, like, okay, if that were my dad, he'd probably rip the life jacket off, and obviously he wouldn't walk up to the house and get drunk, but he would stay there and make sure I'm safe, but he would allow me to sort of have that act of courage so that I could grow from it. And I feel like, and that was years ago now, and I feel like it seems to be getting maybe a little bit worse, where we're trying to take away the challenge of things. And again, you're right. It's very hard to know that balance. And maybe that's where some of it is, because it's like a laziness. Like, how do we find that perfect balance, right?
Yeah, it's laziness. It's like, because people want to go to one extreme or the other. And the hard part is it takes time and effort to pause and think, in this particular situation, is it actually beneficial to do this or not? When people talk about how kids get it really easy today and all this kind of stuff, I'm old enough, and I guess maybe I also grew up in a part of the world, like as many people probably still even do today, where I'm not easily swayed by some of these arguments, because we still had corporal punishment in schools when I was a kid. We had the thing in Scotland called the leather toss. It's like a strap. And we had to stand and hold our hands out, and the teacher would slap you across the hands with this leather strap and get the cane and things like that. And then, I guess when I was 12 or something like that, that was banned from schools. And then parents were banned in some countries from using corporal punishment on their kids and stuff. But I've got a collection of scars from literally, I think I joked earlier about playing in building sites. I literally played on building sites when I was a kid. I nearly drowned 3 times when I was a kid. Set fire to myself umpteen, like all sorts of stuff. Right. I've got all sorts of scars and things, like from growing up and being alive. When I was a kid, I grew up near a wood and a big river and by the sea, and we were just kind of allowed to go out and play on our own, even as small kids, on our bikes and stuff. And we did all sorts of, little boys love doing dangerous things. So I got in a lot of accidents, and I look back in my life and I think definitely there were a few times where I nearly died. And I'm kind of lucky, didn't fall off a cliff or get, drowned or something like that. And then, so I look at my daughter and think, maybe I should, toughen her up and throw, so I'm like, most of those experiences I don't think really benefited me that much, to be honest. I'll tell you what I did take from corporal punishment at school, interestingly. It made me angry. I don't know if it toughened me up, but the main effect I think it had on me as a teenager was I was consumed with anger. And the person that I think that understood that the most as a psychologist was B.F. Skinner. And his famous book that he wrote called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he talks about the risks of punishment as a form of social engineering and operant conditioning is the technical term. And Skinner says, look, if you have people think punishment is a good way of conditioning behaviour, shaping behaviour, psychologists put it. There are pros and cons to doing it, but the downside to punishment, it's a technical downside, is that people experience, there are several downsides, but one of them is that people experience a sense of reward when they avoid the punishment in the future. So if you have a dog and it jumps on your couch and you whack it with a newspaper and say, "Get off the couch," right, whenever it does it, your dog will cower and it'll be like, "Well, I better not go on the couch then, because it's going to whack me again with the newspaper," right? But I've got bad news for you. When you go out of the house and you're not around, the first thing the dog does is jump out on the couch, because now it gets a buzz out of doing it. It thinks he's not around to hit me with the newspaper. And I completely understood that. When I was a kid, I spent half my time plotting ways to get around punishment. And I think that's how a lot of crime operates. A lot of criminals, especially career criminals, get like a huge buzz out of avoiding being caught and punished for the things that they do. So as Skinner realised, there's an obvious problem with using punishment as a form of social conditioning. Well, what if you use loads of punishment and you hurt people badly? Well, the downside of that is that it usually just destroys them. Like, it causes depression, basically. It kind of breaks their character, and then they end up, potentially behaving in quite erratic, unpredictable, or anti-social ways. It's not healthy to severely punish people repeatedly. You're going to end up with more problems by doing that. Skinner thought we should be more intelligent about using positive reinforcement, to try and shape people's behaviour. It's hard to know how to do that, but it requires a little bit more thought. So I think as a kid growing up, the main thing I take from my own experience was just that first of all, exposing myself to a lot of risk. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it made me tougher. And so I don't look at my daughter and think I try to find situations where she could be challenged and stretched. I wouldn't let her play in a building site unsupervised, or I wouldn't let her row a dinghy out to sea, or some of the crazy things that I did when I was a kid. So maybe it's all relative. I don't know, when people talk about going easy on the kids and the kind of nanny state and all that stuff, I'm not sure what the reference point is. When I was a kid, we did a lot of dangerous things, and I feel like now with my daughter, I'm inclined to. I don't see the benefit of that. I'm inclined to be more careful. But I think it's true that I do see people mollycoddling their kids too much and removing any element of competition, and I can definitely see a downside to that. But like I say, I think what the Stoics' main message to us is that actually, I think the whole... I'll say something that might surprise you as well, but I'll say something that it'll be helpful to you and your listeners, because it massively simplifies the entire field of Western philosophy. So, not a lot of people know this. Everyone, I think, who's read the Greek philosophers has heard about the Delphic Oracle, right? And people maybe don't realise that Delphi, which is just outside Athens, it would have been a couple of days' journey in the ancient world. The Delphic Oracle was the priestess of Apollo. Apollo's kind of like a patron god of philosophy. He's, in a sense, the spokesperson of Zeus. He's the son of Zeus, almost like a Christ figure in some ways. And his priestess, he spoke through his priestess. She was possessed by him and channeled him. And so Apollo, speaking through the Pythia, would make these pronouncements. We have 147 of them, if I remember rightly, that are preserved today. They're almost like Zen koans. Most of them are 2 words in Greek. And Plutarch, who was a priest at Delphi of Apollo, and also a famous Platonist philosopher, said these little sayings, he said, are like seeds. They're very ambiguous and they're very short, but many volumes of philosophical texts have been written elaborating on them. Like a koan, it's so much meaning just packed into a couple of words. Now, the 2 most, you don't have to, I'm not going to tell you all 147, right? There's only 2 you need to know. The 2 most famous ones were engraved on the pillar at the entrance to the Temple of Apollo. And one of them is gnothai seauton, which means know thyself. Everybody's heard that. It's a cliche. And it's a motif of all ancient philosophy, particularly in the Socratic tradition. It's the kind of seed, the undercurrent that runs through it all. And the other one is Medan Agan, which means nothing in excess, or all things in moderation. Right? And this is also a recurring motif throughout most ancient philosophy, but particularly in Socrates and in the Stoics. This idea, and also it plays a similar role, slightly different role in Aristotle's philosophy. Now, those 2 sayings, maxims, are related, because in order to know what's in excess or what's too much, you would need to know your own character and nature. You have to know yourself to know what's too much for you. As I was mentioning earlier when we were talking about sparring and exposure therapy and stuff like that, and what Epictetus says about people having to make a judgment for themselves about whether to approach something or whether to avoid it, or what's too much for them to take on. there's a famous example. He says that, and this example may go back to Zeno's Republic. We're told, we know very little about Zeno's Republic, but we know that he describes human society like a herd of cattle. And so it's interesting, in later Stoics, when they mention cattle as a metaphor, it could be that they're alluding to the what was said in Zeno's Republic, right? Maybe. We don't know. We'll never know. So Epictetus very famously, though, says, and I say famously because if you've ever read, one of the few novels about Stoicism is Tom Wolfe's book, A Man in Full, and this passage in Epictetus figures quite prominently in A Man in Full. And in it, Epictetus says, how does a bull know whether it can kill a lion? So he said in every herd there's like a dominant, like an alpha, like bull, and it protects the weaker members of the herd against a lion. Now, I thought that was weird at first, because being Scottish, I'd never really seen this. So I kind of spent a bit of time looking into it, and I was, oh yeah, sure, like a bull can do nasty things to a lion. Like, it'll throw the lion in the air on its horns, like tosses it in the air, it makes a short work of it, potentially. But lions also hunt calves. And so Epictetus would say, how do you know whether you're a calf or a bull? Like, how does it know whether it can fight a lion? Is it going to get eaten by it, or is it going to like toss it in its horns? Like, and Epictetus says, you know from experience, basically gradually growing up, the calves will tussle with each other, and they gradually, through experience, learn to understand their own strength, their own nature, by knowing yourself, by studying yourself. No one's going to come and tell you. Like, you can trust them to. They can say, hey, sure, honestly, buddy, you could take out a lion. Like, I don't know if you want to believe that guy, can you take that for granted? Can you take that guy at his word? And I think I want to kind of like, maybe try myself out on a slightly bigger calf first and see how that goes. Like,
yeah. But
he said through trial and error, growing up, and through kind of like, through, same as sparring, how do you know if you can beat the world champion? Well, you wrestle a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then you kind of figure out either kicking your ass every time, like, or you're doing pretty well. Like, well, if you've beat everyone else, then maybe you've got a chance, like beating the world champion. But if you're getting your butt kicked every time, then maybe you don't. But you have to put yourself out there in steps and stages and study your own behaviour in order to understand your strengths and weaknesses. That's the point that he's making. So know thyself and nothing in excess. This is wisdom and temperance, which are the two of the main. We talked about justice, one of the cardinal virtues earlier. Wisdom and temperance are two of wisdom, obviously, in all philosophy. The virtue of temperance or self-discipline is a major motif in Stoic philosophy and in general. The Stoics were known, if anything, for being similar to Socrates, except that in part one of the differences is that they place, and Socrates put a lot of emphasis on temperance and self-control, but the Stoics put even more emphasis on training and self-discipline than Socrates had. The Xenophon, who was Socrates' student and friend, he says something very interesting. He loves Socrates. He's a huge admirer of him. People think we only know of Socrates through Plato's dialogues, but we also have the dialogues of Xenophon and some other bits and pieces. Xenophon knew Socrates much better than Plato did, incidentally. He was an older friend of his. Xenophon's version of Socrates is more like the Stoics, and the Stoics, in fact, at least in the surviving texts, mention Xenophon's Socrates more often than they mention Plato, or about equally. Xenophon said there was only one thing that he thought Socrates did wrong. Curiously. So if you're into ancient philosophy, you think, what was that? Like, that sounds interesting. What was the thing that he thought Socrates did wrong? And he says, Xenophon was a soldier. He was an Athenian general, famously. He said, I don't think Socrates taught his students enough about self-discipline and trained them enough in self-discipline before he went on and taught them dialectic and rhetoric and stuff like that. And so some of them, like Alcibiades, were kind of drunkards and became reckless, and they showed off their argumentative ability and rhetorical skills, and they thought they were experts in politics. They kind of became arrogant because he hadn't trained them sufficiently in temperance and self-discipline. And that criticism in Xenophon, I think it's notable that it's answered by the Stoics. Like, it's like the Stoics read that and went, okay, like in that case, we're going to be like Socrates, but put more emphasis on practical training and self-mastery and self-discipline.
Interesting. Yeah, the self, know thyself, that's very interesting. I'd like to tie that back to what you mentioned about you growing up with when you got angry about the corporal punishment. And it's interesting to me because as you're describing the way you grew up, it's kind of exactly the same way I grew up. I grew up like, running around the woods and by the ocean. I grew up in a fishing village, right? And so, you swim in the ocean, swim in the lake, running around, in the woods, that kind of stuff. And same kind of thing, just pretty much no limits on what I could do. And like you, yeah, like I think it did have a positive impact on me, but in the same way you did, I feel like maybe there were some times where I probably, it's lucky that I got out alive, so to speak, right? So it's interesting to me, but what sort of differentiates a little bit, I think, you and I, is that, so I didn't deal with that corporal punishment, but I did have anger issues growing up. And so I'm very interested to know sort of how, if you're willing to open up about it, like how you dealt with that personally, because I sort of fell backwards into how I deal with it and how I learned to deal with it. And it was actually through strength training. And that's why it's one of the words in my podcast, the Strong Stoic podcast, is because it was through strength training that allowed me to sort of transcend that. And I think really that got down to what you mentioned about knowing yourself and self-discipline and being able to achieve something. But it was also like a physical way of just getting out that energy, which I really, really needed when I was, a testosterone-fueled young male teenager, right? So, and obviously philosophy played a huge role in that as well, but I still think that predominantly it was, and the philosophy was learned in many ways through strength training, but there was a huge physical aspect as well that I found just invaluable, and I don't know if I could have transcended it without that. How did you deal with that? How did you get through it? Do you still struggle with it, or how? I guess what do you?
I asked my daughter about that once. I said, "Has she ever seen me get angry?" And for a long time, she said no. And then I did get angry with somebody once. Like she saw me get angry with somebody. But she's 10 now. I think she's only ever seen me get angry once on one occasion. It wasn't with her. And I personally, I kind of feel like. And sometimes I feel like my anger, because I was so angry, William Blake also said if the fool would simply persist in his folly, he would succeed in becoming wise. And sometimes it's true that if you have a vice that's so pronounced, like it can kind of force you into dealing with it in a way. So some of the most temperate people I've ever met have been recovering alcoholics or drug addicts. Right, like because they're forced to confront a vice in a way that maybe other people don't if they have a milder version of the same vice. So like I was so angry that I had no choice but to kind of deal with my anger, and I feel like in some ways it kind of feels to me like it just went away over time. Like I woke up one day and I just wasn't angry anymore. But I think there were things. Now when I was a teenager, for a while, like and this was a long time ago now. But for a while, I got into bodybuilding because one of my best friends was a champion bodybuilder.
Oh, nice.
And so I would train with him. I trained well in the gym where all the nightclub bouncers trained. And I got into taekwondo for a while and stuff like that. Because when I was a young guy, I was in trouble quite a lot. I kind of got kicked out of school. And I was in trouble with the police and local kind of gangs or whatever quite a bit and things. So there was definitely for quite a few years I was kind of obsessed with these things. But I don't know that they necessarily. I think in some ways they benefited my anger. In other ways, like they were possibly kind of an extension of it or something. So for me, doing those things was about fighting and kind of protecting myself, and it was kind of part of the whole dynamic of like conflict and stuff. And I think when I overcame, maybe in some ways it helped. I kind of remember taekwondo maybe helping me feel a lot more confident and less scared sometimes.
Yeah.
In some ways that helped me respond less with anger. But I think really I overcame my anger a few years later, kind of in steps and stages, and it was through studying philosophy. I kind of, in a way, I sort of more reasoned my way out of it. I started to just think that anger was kind of pointless. There are a number of arguments that the Stoics use to challenge anger. Marcus Aurelius lists 10, which I think is remarkable. He lists 10 cognitive strategies for remedying anger at one point in the Meditations. I often say this, so I won't dwell on it, but I trained psychotherapists for many years, and clinical psychologists and psychiatrists and counsellors and life coaches and all those sort of guys. And that was my bread and butter all day long. And I would say, if I said to one of my classes, how many cognitive strategies can you guys name for overcoming anger? Like, they'd probably look at me in shock for a minute and go, oh, geez, we've got to do some work. And then they'd come up with like 2 or 3, or maybe they could squeeze out 4 or 5 between them. I don't think they'd come out with 10. So I maybe as a therapist, I'm in a good position to say there are a number of things that I think are exceptional about the Stoics, that I find that remarkable, that he could list. Not only does he list them, but he repeatedly refers to them, selections from that list throughout the rest of the Meditations. So it's like he knows these by heart. That's how it comes across to me. And this is a very extensive repertoire of techniques similar to ones that we'd find in modern cognitive therapy. Modern psychologists, therapists would not, off the top of their head anyway, be able to name anything like that range of techniques for that particular problem. No, most of them wouldn't anyway, unless perhaps they were specialists in that area. They were given a lot more time to think about it. So by using some of those kind of techniques, and one of them actually is, or a related technique, is that the Stoics thought anger was temporary madness. This is basically the main thing that benefited me, right? And just from a hard-nosed, psychological, evidence-based research perspective, I know that when you get angry, or when you experience depression or anxiety or other strong emotions, your brain goes into essentially a different mode of functioning, is the best way to think about it. Like, not only does your physiology kind of change in certain ways, but your brain works differently, and a bunch of a whole barrage of cognitive biases come into effect. My favourite one, just to pick one, is that when people are angry, we know from research that they typically underestimate risk. So, for example, Muhammad Ali, when he was fighting George Foreman, was very clear that he thought George Foreman's biggest weakness was his anger, because it would lead him to underestimate the risk of throwing too many punches, maybe dropping his guard and exposing himself during the fight. And Ali thought that's the way to beat him, because anger is temporary stupidity, anger is temporary madness. People lose perspective when they're angry, and they make judgments. And it's strange because we associate anger with strength, but very clearly, so you think of that example, that fight, anger was vulnerability, fragility, weakness in that situation. To put it very simply, an angry guy will drop his guard, potentially. He doesn't think about protecting himself as much. He exposes himself, but he also exposes the people around him to danger, because he naturally underestimates risk. We know that. And there's also other cognitive problems that occur with anger. So just being very familiar with that. Socrates makes this same point in Plato's Republic, incidentally, very clearly. In Book 10 of Plato's Republic, he says very clearly that people who grieve excessively, or people who become very, very distressed, lose precisely the thing that's most required in the face of a crisis. In Glaucon, Plato's brother says, what's that? And Socrates says, the ability to think rationally. And clearly that's what you need to problem solve in a crisis. So why would you want to get your knickers in a twist and get all worked up about something when you know that invariably means that you're not going to be able to solve problems? Angry people are rubbish at problem solving. Generally, with some exception, but generally speaking, they're rubbish at problem solving. If you imagine you're fixing a leaking tap, is one of my favourite examples, and you somehow hit your thumb with a wrench or something like that, and it starts to bleed, and you get really annoyed, and you throw the wrench across the room, and you're really, really angry, and now you kind of keep trying to fix the broken thing. Everyone knows that you start to mess it up, and you get frustrated, and you can't even fix a broken tap. It should be a simple thing to do. So if you can't fix a broken tap when you're losing your rat and you're getting really angry and all that, if we're rubbish at doing simple things like that, what are the chances that we're going to be able to fix a broken relationship, when we're angry, or a broken society if we get angry about it. Literally, we might as well be flicking a switch in our brain that puts it into a wonky mode of functioning, and then go, okay, now solve the problem. One of the most intricate and complex and ambiguous types of problem is social, interpersonal problems. Anger is extremely unhelpful when you're confronting this. And I think I just realised that. It dawned on me one day that I thought, anger equals stupidity. Why? Literally, it's just a form of stupidity. Why would I want to allow myself to? And if I wanted to deal with people that were threatening me or causing me problems or a situation, anger's going to clearly make me worse at doing that. Mm-hmm. I'm much more likely to be able to cope with this in a rational state of mind. I can respond much more strategically, more tactically, rather than just kind of lashing out and doing stupid things. Anger's a blunt instrument.
It is, and what scared me most about it is when you're in that moment, when you're absorbed into anger, it's not like you're recognizing that you're being an asshole. It just feels good, right? I think maybe this is people who haven't experienced this. It does. It feels good to be angry when you're angry, but then when you're looking back, it's like, oh shit, just you feel terrible about it afterwards. But in the moment, it's like this adrenaline going through you, and it's anyways that
like a drug.
It is, and that particular feeling always just scared the shit out of me because it's very tempting when something feels good, even if it feels like shit afterwards, But
we talk about sometimes righteous or justified anger, but I think that's a kind of stupid idea as well. Aristotle has this idea that you can have moderate and righteous anger, and it could be beneficial. And the Stoics, particularly Seneca, who wrote a whole book about it, are much clearer that this is a very dangerous idea. Because who's the judge of whether your anger is moderate or righteous? Well, it's on you, buddy. Right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but every angry person thinks that they're justified, pretty much.
Yeah, they do.
Angry people are self-righteous as anything, and so they all believe that it's everyone else's fault and they're right. And even though from an outside point of view, we might think that's laughable. It seems kind of convincing when you're angry, that's part of the problem. I should say, the Stoics thought anger was the main. Just a little bit of trivia for you. We normally divide the negative emotions into three categories in psychotherapy, just for the sake of simplicity, right? So we'll say it's anger, fear, and sadness. Take your pick. I've got a bit of both. Got a bit of all three. So anger, fear, and sadness. Now, psychotherapists, you will have heard, deal with fear in the form of anxiety disorders. And they deal with sadness in the form of clinical depression. We've got a lot of that kind of stuff. Anger, maybe a little bit here and there, but not as much. There's a third, if you like, of that classification that we don't deal with as much. We get angry clients, but it's usually depressed clients who have a bit of anger, or sometimes anxious clients who have a bit of anger. It's rare that somebody would self-refer because their main presenting problem is anger. Now, those people do end up in therapy, usually because they're referred by someone else. So in relationships, it might be their spouse that says you need therapy to deal with your anger. Or in an institution like a prison or a school or the military, somebody might be told you need to go and talk to a therapist about your anger problem. They'll say, who, me? It's not my problem, it's you guys that need therapy. Because anger is an externalizing emotion, and one of the cognitive biases is that we tend to attribute blame to other people. Now, one of the problems with that is it means we're unlikely to seek help for it itself. Now, one of the social problems with that, I'll make a big point here about self-help and stuff in general. If you say, well, forget about therapy and stuff like that, we'll just forget about parenting, we're just going to let people do self-help. We live in a self-help culture. There's self-help all over the internet. It's some of the best-selling books are in self-help. There's all chunks of bookshops dedicated to it. The internet's like awash with self-help advice. Right? Problem is that if the problem is with your judgment and perspective in the first place, and particularly if you're angry, and so you think it's everyone else that needs therapy, you're not going to, not many people are going to seek out self-help to deal with a primary problem of anger. And so anger ends up being untreated in a self-help society. And people read books and they do their little worksheets and they do their meditations and stuff like that. And if you're not careful, one way in which self-help can become toxic and does become toxic on a huge societal scale is when it turns into a form of avoidance. And people are working on myself, but they're working on the wrong feelings. They're not working on the feelings that are actually the problem. They're working on everything else. Like, it's kind of like there's a big fire blazing over here, and you're just kind of like going, yeah, but just let me fix this leaking tap over here. Like, I'm doing something constructive. You go, dude, your house is burning down. Like, that's where I think people have a hard time understanding that. They go, but I'm doing something constructive. Yeah, you're doing something constructive while ignoring this huge problem that you've got and doing nothing about, then it's a diversion from putting the work in where it needs to happen. I think that's clearly an issue. We could all go off right now and look on YouTube videos by famous self-help and self-improvement gurus, particular ones that might actually say and do things that are unhelpful in this regard. And we could look at the comments under them and find many examples of angry, usually young men, but not always, like saying angry and aggressive and violent stuff. But yet they're supposed to be watching self-improvement videos and reading self-improvement books. And I think this is a cultural phenomenon, but there was similar things happened in the ancient world to some extent. The Sophists, and by the way, Plato's Republic is in some ways is about this. Thrasymachus, you just look him up on Wikipedia, is the sophist at the beginning of Plato's Republic. Oh man, many people have observed he couldn't sound more like Nietzsche, and he also kind of sounds a bit like Jordan Peterson at times, and guys like that. So the main guy that Socrates is arguing with, he sounds kind of familiar anyway. I'll let people argue between themselves about who he sounds most like. I think it's fair to say he sounds quite a lot like Nietzsche. But you'll see echoes of this in modern self-improvement gurus. And so the Sophists were doing this kind of same thing. They had a whole career about helping people to improve themselves. But Thrasymachus thinks anger is good, and his name means fierce fighter, incidentally, in Greek. So it's kind of like a pun, perhaps. But he, so he's encouraging people to focus on areas of self-improvement, but in the process neglecting this one glaring flaw in their character, which is their hostility and anger and bigotry and prejudice and whatnot towards other members of the society in which they live, and their lack of pro-social attitudes. Thrasymachus thought pro-social attitudes were guff. He actually goes on about how he thinks these people are like sheep. It's for the weak, he says. It's kind of might is right philosophy, and he thinks that the virtue of justice is garbage, he thinks, and it's for he's pretty explicitly says he thinks it's a kind of con that the weak in society are duped by. Obviously that sounds a lot like Nietzsche. Maybe people might say it's a caricature in Nietzsche, but it's hard to read them side by side and not think there's obviously some similarity going on there. Nietzsche stuff about slave morality and all that sounds very like what Thrasymachus is saying about the sheep that follow justice. And so Socrates allegedly tries to demolish this argument. So I don't know, people may or may not agree with what Socrates says, but go and check it out. It's only book one of Plato's Republic. He systematically takes this argument apart in several levels.
Cool.
But yeah, I think this is an endemic problem in modern society. Now, the way I would put it to people is that I think of anger as being the royal road to self-improvement. The more people talk about self-improvement today, the more they're usually neglecting anger. You said right at the beginning, people don't think pro-social attitudes have got a role in Stoicism.
Yeah.
That sounds more like Thrasymachus and some of the Sophists were saying. The Stoics, geez man, Seneca wrote an entire book about overcoming anger and replacing it with pro-social attitudes. The Stoics thought anger, of those three emotions that I mentioned, was the main one that we need to deal with. And so that, in a sense, that's different from modern psychotherapy, where it's relatively neglected. They thought, no, it's anger that's the kind of the big ticket item here. And Marcus Aurelius, not only does Seneca talk about it, but I would say that the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, to a large extent, contains a lot of different stuff, but to a large extent it can be viewed, as I kind of alluded to earlier, as his attempt to overcome his own anger.
Yeah.
Because he says, how do we know Marcus Aurelius was angry? Because he says so at the beginning of the book. Like, he says in black and white, like in book 1 of the Meditations, that he had problems controlling his own temper, and that he thanks the gods that he never did anything that he might have regretted afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, and he says also that the person he got most angry with was Junius Rusticus, his Stoic mentor, and the guy that introduced him to Stoic psychotherapy. He even uses the word therapia. He says Rusticus persuaded him that he needed therapy from based on Stoic principles. What would that look like? I guess it would look pretty similar to Seneca's On Anger, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That is a book about Stoic therapy for anger. So then, having said that, like I say, later in the book, Marcus draws up this bullet point list of 10 separate coping strategies for dealing with anger based on Stoicism. So, I think what Marcus is doing, in a sense, is opposite of some of these modern self-improvement gurus who neglect anger or implicitly encourage it. His book is all about his acknowledging his anger, like, and systematically trying to cure it and overcome it and replace it with pro-social attitudes.
Yeah.
Like love and friendship and stuff like that.
I could talk all day about. I think we could go on for another hour just on anger, because I think it's one that we're both. It's interesting. We both have personal experience with it and a lot of thoughts on it as well. But I do want to end it there. Listen, thank you so much. Seriously, it's been a great pleasure having you on and talking about obviously Stoicism, CBT, and everything else. Any last words? I know I'll put all your links in the show notes, but people can find you pretty readily. I think Donald Robertson.
I think if they Google me, like, they can find me.
I think they'll find
books and stuff like that. Yeah.
I saw. I googled you just before the chat here, just to find your website, and there's a website called what is it? Robertson. It's an artist.
I know. I was being interviewed by a guy in a podcast once, and he said, have you ever had a conversation with someone and you're just like really confused about where the conversation's going and stuff like that? So this dude was like asking me about whether something about he knew someone that worked in the perfume industry, and like he wondered if I'd kind of come across them, and he knew that I'd kind of worked on perfume, and I was like,
uh-oh.
What? Like, yeah. And then I realised that I thought that was strange, like, what was all that about? And then afterwards I realised that he'd Googled me and found that guy who's also called Donald Robertson and is a graphic designer and had designed packaging for a perfume bottle. Like, and he thought that's who I was, and like, and I had this really confused conversation with him.
That's
like,
hilarious.
Perfume got to do with Stoicism?
That's right.
So that's not me. If you just Google me and then ignore any stuff about graphic design or perfume bottles, then
the Robertson, you'll find him. Sounds good. Thanks again so much. All the best.
It's a pleasure.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.